She spent all her money on a plot of forest land, dreaming of peace and nature. But the old railroad tracks led her to a train car that wasn't mentioned in the documents. What she found inside forced her to call the FBI. Subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the story, and write in the comments which city you're watching from. She did not arrive at the decision suddenly, and she did not arrive at it lightly. For years, the idea had lived somewhere beneath the surface of her ordinary life, quiet and persistent, like a pressure that never quite went away. It grew not from romance or fantasy, but from fatigue, from the slow erosion of meaning that came with days measured by schedules, screens, and obligations that multiplied faster than they resolved. She had learned how to function well within that world. She had learned how to appear stable, reasonable, and cautious. What she had not learned was how to feel present in it. Her life before the land was not dramatic. That, perhaps, was the problem. She worked steadily, lived carefully, paid what needed to be paid, spoke when expected to speak, and kept her doubts private. There were relationships that had softened into habits, and friendships that had become conversations. Repeated out of politeness rather than necessity. Nothing was broken enough to justify escape. Nothing was alive enough to justify staying. The thought of land came to her gradually. Not a house, not a retreat, not a cabin hidden from the world, but land itself. A place that did not ask for constant explanation. A place that did not need to be managed into submission. She began reading about conservation, about low-impact recreation, about spaces where people were allowed to enter without conquering. The idea formed slowly, deliberately. She didn't want to disappear. She wanted to build something that respected absence. When she finally began to act, the process stripped away any illusion of comfort. Selling her apartment was the first irrevocable step. It was not large, but it was secure, and security has a way of disguising itself as wisdom. Each signature on each document felt heavier than the last. She watched numbers move from one account to another, watched her margin for error narrow, and understood with a clarity that surprised her that this was not a temporary experiment. When the transaction was complete, there would be no quiet return to the life she had left. The money would exist only as soil, trees, distance, and responsibility. The reactions came quickly once she told people what she was doing. At first, there was disbelief, delivered with polite laughter, as if she were testing a joke that had gone on too long. Then came concern, framed as care. She was reminded of her age, of safety, of market realities, of risks that did not appear on the surface of enthusiasm. Some spoke of loneliness. Others spoke of failure, not cruelly, but with the certainty of those who believed they understood the shape of her limits better than she did. The most difficult conversations were not arguments, but silences. Moments when she could see in their eyes that they had already rewritten her decision as a mistake she would eventually regret. She listened. She did not argue. There was no version of her reasoning that could compete with the comfort of their doubt. What she carried instead was quieter and more stubborn. It was the understanding that she had already spent years choosing the safe alternative, and that it had cost her something she could no longer name without bitterness. The land itself did not present kindly. It was large, irregular, and inconveniently distant from anything that could be called infrastructure. The forest was old, not in the romantic sense of towering grandeur, but in the way age settles into things unevenly. Some areas were open and breathable, with light filtering down in long, slanted bands. Others were dense, tangled, resistant. The terrain shifted subtly, rising and falling in ways that were easy to miss until they were underfoot. Water moved through it quietly, shaping channels that only revealed themselves after rain. Her first days there were spent walking. She did not mark anything immediately. She carried no flags, no stakes, no tools beyond what she needed to move safely. She wanted to feel the land before she defined it. Patterns emerged slowly. There were places that felt neutral, passable without resistance. There were places that felt generous, where the forest opened just enough to invite pause. And there were places she avoided without conscious decision, where the air felt heavier, the silence more complete. At night, alone in a temporary shelter, she planned carefully. Her vision for the project remained disciplined. No large structures, no clear-cut paths. Trails would follow what already existed. People would be guests, not occupants. There would be limits, enforced quietly, without spectacle. It was not a business designed for growth. It was a place designed for restraint. It was during one of her longer boundary walks, weeks into her stay, that she noticed the line. At first, it registered as a mistake of perception, a trick of light or shadow. Forests create false geometry all the time, patterns that dissolve when approached. But this line did not dissolve. It persisted, cutting through the natural irregularity with a steadiness that did not belong. She followed it cautiously, stepping closer, then closer still, until she could no longer deny its nature. Beneath moss and soil, beneath roots that had grown around it rather than through it, was metal. Cold, straight, deliberate. She knelt and brushed away debris with her hands, exposing the unmistakable curve and edge of an old rail. The discovery unsettled her more than she expected, not because of what it might lead to, but because of what it implied. Rail lines were not casual things. They were planned, funded, documented. They left records. And yet, she knew with certainty that nothing like this had appeared in any of the material she had reviewed before purchasing the land. She stood there for a long time, hand resting against the exposed metal, listening to the forest resume its ordinary sounds around her. The land had not announced this to her. It had not warned her or guided her. It had simply allowed her to notice. By the time she turned back toward her shelter, the line of the rail remained fixed in her mind. It did not yet feel like a mystery. It felt like a responsibility she had not asked for and could not ignore. She understood, with a calm that surprised her, that the project she had imagined would not unfold as cleanly as she had planned. The land, it seemed, had its own history, and it was not finished with it yet. She returned to the place the next morning with a different kind of attention. The discovery of the rail had not followed her into sleep as panic or excitement, but as a persistent weight, an awareness that something ordinary had been quietly overturned. In the hours before dawn, she had replayed the moment of recognition again and again, each time testing it for exaggeration. In daylight, she told herself, it would look smaller, less deliberate, more easily explained. Old logging equipment, perhaps, a remnant of some forgotten private effort, something that would lose its significance once exposed to reason. The forest, however, did not cooperate with her hopes. In the clean light of morning, the rail looked even more precise than it had the day before. The moss that had covered it now seemed less like neglect and more like camouflage, granted by time rather than intention. She knelt again and worked patiently, clearing a longer section, exposing the metal in a continuous line that disappeared beneath the soil in both directions. It was heavy, industrial, unmistakably part of a system designed to carry weight over distance. She followed it a short way, then stopped. Her instincts told her to proceed slowly, not out of fear, but out of respect for whatever logic had placed the rail here in the first place. She had walked this land carefully since arriving. She knew where the ground softened after rain, where roots twisted close to the surface, where stones lay just beneath the leaf litter. This line ignored all of that. It cut forward with an indifference that did not belong to the forest. She tested it physically, pressing down with her foot, then her full weight. It did not shift. The rail had been anchored deeply, laid by people who expected it to last. That expectation unsettled her more than the object itself. Temporary things are easy to dismiss. Permanent ones demand explanation. Back at her shelter, she spread out the materials she had brought with her. Maps, surveys, copies of land records. She traced the boundaries of her property again, noting where the rail fell in relation to them. It ran well within her land, far from any edges that might suggest shared responsibility or jurisdictional confusion. She checked older maps next, those marked with faint lines and outdated place names. Nothing. No industrial markings, no transport corridors, no notes in the margins. The absence began to press on her more heavily than any confirmation could have. Records did not simply forget railways, they erased them. Or they were never allowed to include them in the first place. For the first time since arriving, she considered calling someone. Not the authorities, not yet, but someone with local knowledge, someone who might remember a story passed down without documentation. The thought faded almost as quickly as it arose. The nearest town was distant, its connection to this land tenuous at best. Whatever this was, it had been designed to avoid precisely that kind of memory. That realization forced her into a decision she had been circling since the moment of discovery. She could leave the rail as it was, mark it on her private notes, reroute her plans around it, and never follow it further. The land would remain hers. Her project would remain intact. No one would ever know what lay beyond the short section she had uncovered. The alternative was less defined and therefore more dangerous. Following the rail meant accepting that she might uncover something that would not allow her to return to ignorance. Ownership carried responsibilities that extended beyond financial investment. She had claimed the land. The land, it seemed, was now making a claim of its own. She chose to follow it. The decision did not feel brave. It felt inevitable. She prepared carefully, bringing water, marking her starting point, leaving a note at her shelter that said nothing specific but established a timeline for her return. These were habits formed not from adventure, but from prudence. She had not come here to disappear. As she walked, the forest changed in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. The understory thinned. Fallen branches lay in patterns that suggested long-term disturbance rather than random decay. She noticed the absence of animal tracks, a detail that only registered after minutes of attentive walking. The rail, she realized, had once been more than a line of transport. It had been a boundary. Animals avoided it instinctively, as if some echo of its original purpose remained. The air grew cooler as the canopy tightened. Sound carried differently, absorbed rather than reflected. She felt, not for the first time since arriving, that she had stepped into a pocket of the land shaped by intention rather than chance. The rail guided her forward, never curving, never hesitating, its direction fixed with a confidence that suggested long planning. She lost track of time. Distance became difficult to judge without familiar landmarks. The forest offered no obvious clues, no signs of proximity to roads or settlements. When she began to feel fatigue, it arrived not as physical exhaustion, but as a quiet mental strain, the effort of remaining alert in a space that resisted interpretation. It was then that she noticed the geometry ahead. At first, it appeared as a distortion in the vertical rhythm of the trees, lines that were too straight, angles that interrupted the organic flow of branches and trunks. She slowed, heart steady but attentive, and advanced with deliberate care. The structure revealed itself gradually, not the rail's end, but a covering, a wooden form rising above the ground, partially obscured by foliage, but undeniably artificial. Thick beams anchored into the earth, a roofline visible through gaps in the leaves. The rail led directly toward it, disappearing beneath its shadow. She stopped at the edge of the clearing and took in the scene without moving. The structure was not collapsing. It was not improvised. It had been built with the same expectation of permanence as the rail itself. Weathered, yes, but intact. The wood had aged rather than failed. Only then did she understand that whatever lay ahead wasn't meant to be discovered accidentally. It had been protected, preserved, hidden in plain sight by being placed where no one expected anything to be at all. She did not step forward immediately. She stood there, listening to the forest hold its breath around her, and felt the weight of the path she had chosen settle fully into place. The rail had not ended. It had led her exactly where it was meant to. And she had followed. She remained where she was longer than she realized, standing at the edge of the clearing with the rail vanishing beneath the structure ahead. The forest around her felt altered, not hostile, not welcoming, but attentive in a way she could not articulate. The decision to move forward came without ceremony. She adjusted the strap of her pack, took a steady breath, and stepped out from the cover of the trees. The wooden canopy revealed itself piece by piece as she approached. It was larger than she had first assumed, not sprawling, but deliberately proportioned. Thick vertical posts had been driven deep into the ground, their bases darkened by decades of moisture. Horizontal beams connected them with a precision that spoke of planning rather than improvisation. The roof sloped gently, constructed to shed snow and rain away from whatever lay beneath. There was no rot at the joints, no sag in the structure. Time had weathered it, softened its edges, but it had not weakened it. Only when she stood fully beneath the canopy did she see the rail car. It was an old railway carriage, narrow and elongated, its metal sides dulled by age but intact. The paint, once a muted industrial color, had faded into something indistinct, blending with the shadows beneath the roof. The car rested squarely on the rails, aligned with a precision that suggested it had not been moved since the day it arrived. There were no signs of impact, no indication that it had been abandoned hastily or dragged into place as an afterthought. It stood as if it had always belonged there. Her first instinct was to circle it. She moved slowly, noting details with an attention sharpened by unease. The wheels were rusted but functional. The undercarriage bore marks of maintenance, bolts tightened and replaced over time. A narrow set of steps led up to one end, their metal worn smooth by repeated use. This was not a relic left to decay. It was a structure that had been lived with. The canopy, she realized, was as important as the car itself. It extended just far enough beyond the roofline to shield it from direct exposure, protecting it from the worst of the elements. The placement was deliberate. From above, from a distance, the roof would blend with the forest floor when viewed through the trees. Smoke, if there ever had been any, would have dissipated beneath the canopy before rising into open air. She paused beneath the center of the structure and listened. Sound behaved differently here. The canopy absorbed it, dampening even her footsteps. The forest beyond felt farther away, as if separated by more than physical distance. It was the first time since entering the clearing that she felt a flicker of something like apprehension. The door to the railcar stood closed. It was not locked. She placed her hand against the metal before opening it, half expecting some resistance, some signal that she had crossed a boundary. The surface was cool, dry, and solid. When she pulled, the door opened smoothly, its hinges quiet, well-oiled at some point not too far in the past, to be dismissed as ancient history. Inside, the air was still but not stale. The space was narrow, yet carefully arranged. A small cast-iron stove occupied one corner, its flue rising cleanly through the ceiling and disappearing into a fitted opening in the canopy roof above. The workmanship was precise. The stove had been installed by someone who understood heat, airflow, and concealment. Nearby, a simple table stood bolted to the floor, its surface scarred by years of use. A single bunk lined one wall, its frame sturdy, its mattress long since collapsed into itself. There were shelves along the opposite side, holding objects that had been left exactly where they belonged. Tin cups, a kettle, tools arranged by size and function. Nothing decorative. Nothing personal enough to suggest sentiment, yet nothing careless either. This was a place designed for long habitation by someone who valued order and predictability. She moved through the space slowly, touching nothing at first. Her presence felt intrusive in a way that surprised her. She had explored abandoned buildings before, places stripped bare by time and curiosity. This was different. The car felt paused rather than abandoned, as if its occupant had stepped away with the intention of returning. The stove bore evidence of frequent use. Ash had been cleared regularly, the firebox maintained. The flue connection showed signs of careful sealing, ensuring no smoke escaped beyond the canopy. Whoever had lived here had been meticulous, not out of obsession, but necessity. Visibility had been a risk. As she stood there, absorbing the stillness, a realization took hold with unsettling clarity. This railcar was not simply hidden, it was preserved. The canopy had not been built to protect the forest from the structure, but to protect the structure from time, weather, and discovery. Someone had invested effort and resources to ensure that this place remained functional long after its original purpose had passed. She became aware of a subtle pressure, not on her ears, but on her sense of space. The canopy compressed the world above. The railcar enclosed it further. It felt as though layers had been stacked deliberately to create isolation. Sound did not travel here. Light filtered in reluctantly. Even the forest seemed to keep its distance. Her unease deepened as she began to notice patterns. The wear on the floor suggested a single occupant rather than many. The bunk was narrow. The table bore marks consistent with writing or sorting rather than eating. There were no personal effects that would indicate family or companionship. This had been a solitary life, structured and sustained over time. She turned back toward the entrance, her eyes adjusting to the shift in light, and that was when she noticed the irregularity in the floor. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a seam, a join between panels. But the alignment was too precise, the edges too clean. She knelt and ran her fingers along it, tracing the outline of a square section set flush with the surrounding boards. The wood there was newer, less worn, treated to resist moisture, a concealed hatch. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she sat back on her heels and let the implications settle. The railcar itself had been hidden. The canopy had been constructed to shield it. And beneath the railcar, beneath all of that, there was something else. Her thoughts returned to the rail, to its straight, uncompromising line cutting through the forest, to the absence of records, to the way the land had seemed to funnel her toward this point. The pieces did not form a clear picture, but they suggested scale. This was not the work of a single eccentric individual. It bore the mark of coordination, of planning carried out with the expectation of scrutiny and the intention of avoiding it. She stood and moved back toward the door, stepping out beneath the canopy once more. From there, she looked up at the beams overhead, at the way the structure blended with its surroundings, neither decaying nor drawing attention. It struck her then that the canopy itself might have been the most important element of all. The railcar could have been removed. The rail could have been dismantled. But the canopy ensured continuity. It was the anchor, the constant. For the first time since discovering the rail, she felt something beyond curiosity and responsibility. She felt watched, not in the immediate sense of being observed, but in the broader sense of having entered a space shaped by intention so specific that it extended beyond the people who had built it. This place had been designed to outlast its creators. She returned inside and knelt once more by the hatch. Her hand hovered over the recessed handle, fingers brushing the wood without gripping it. She was acutely aware that opening it would alter the nature of her involvement. Until now, she had been a finder, a witness. Beyond that point, she would become something else. She did not open it yet. Instead, she closed the door of the railcar carefully behind her and stepped back into the forest, leaving the canopy and its hidden occupant undisturbed. She needed distance, daylight, and time to think. As she followed the rail back through the trees, the forest seemed to breathe again, sound returning gradually, space expanding around her. But the sense of compression remained within her. She knew she would return. The canopy, the railcar, and the concealed space beneath it had already taken hold of her plans, reshaping them in ways she could not yet define. The land she had come to protect had revealed its first demand, and she had only just begun to understand the cost of answering it. She did not return to the canopy immediately. For the rest of that day, and much of the night that followed, the image of the concealed hatch stayed with her in fragments rather than as a whole. It appeared in her thoughts not as an object, but as a question that refused to be shaped into language. She understood instinctively that what lay beneath the railcar was not simply an extension of the space above it. It was something that had required intention, concealment, and a willingness to dig into the earth itself. That kind of effort was never expended without purpose. Sleep came late and lightly. When it did, it brought no clarity, only repetition. The straightness of the rail, the silence beneath the canopy, the sense that the forest had drawn a line she was now standing on the wrong side of. By morning, hesitation had thinned into resolve, not excitement, not dread, but the quiet acceptance that avoiding the truth would not restore the life she had imagined for the land. Whatever lay below was already part of it. She prepared with care, not theatrically, not as if embarking on an expedition, but with the practical caution of someone who understood risk. She packed extra water, a flashlight, spare batteries, a small first aid kit. She marked her position on a map, noted the time, and left a written record of where she was going and when she expected to return. It was the first time she had done so since arriving, and the act itself carried a weight that confirmed the seriousness of what she was about to do. When she reached the canopy again, it looked unchanged, indifferent to her absence. The railcar stood exactly as she had left it, the forest pressing in at a respectful distance. She stepped beneath the structure and felt the familiar compression settle around her, the way sound dulled and space narrowed. Inside the railcar, the air was cooler than the day before, unmoving, as if sealed from the passage of time. She knelt beside the hatch without ceremony. This time, she did not pause. Her fingers closed around the recessed handle, and she lifted. The panel moved smoothly, heavier than it appeared, revealing a dark opening below. A faint draft rose from it, carrying a smell that was neither damp nor decayed, but distinctly enclosed. She angled her flashlight downward and let the beam cut through the darkness. What it revealed was not a crude pit or improvised storage space. The opening led to a set of steps, reinforced with metal brackets and wood that had been treated against moisture and rot. The workmanship was precise, professional. She descended slowly, testing each step before committing her weight, the sound of her movement swallowed almost immediately by the surrounding earth. The space below opened gradually, revealing itself in layers. The ceiling was higher than she had expected, supported by beams that bore signs of careful engineering. The walls were lined, not raw soil, but a combination of reinforced panels and poured concrete. This was not a cellar. It was not a shelter built in haste. It was a structure designed to last. As she moved further in, the temperature stabilized, cooler than the surface but consistent, controlled. The floor was level, free of debris. Electrical conduits ran along one wall, their presence unsettling in its implication. There were fixtures mounted overhead, old but intact, suggesting that this space had once been fully powered. The flashlight beam swept across a series of shelves and storage units. On them lay objects that shifted her understanding of the place, from uneasy curiosity to something far more serious. Metal cases marked with faded stenciling, instruments she did not immediately recognize, but which carried the unmistakable precision of specialized equipment. Binders and folders, their edges worn, their contents protected by layers of plastic and care. She opened one of the folders with hands that felt steadier than she expected. Inside were documents typed in formats she recognized only vaguely, their language dense and formal, filled with references to locations, dates, and procedures. Names appeared in places where she had expected codes. Some were crossed out, others were followed by notations she did not yet understand. What struck her most was not any single detail, but the sheer consistency of the material. This was not an isolated operation. It was part of something larger, systematic, and deliberate. As she moved deeper into the space, the implications accumulated. Charts lined one wall, their markings faded but legible. Maps annotated by hand, with routes traced and retraced, including a line that matched the rail above. The railcar was no accident. It was infrastructure. The canopy was protection. This underground space was the core. She felt a tightening in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. It was the realization that whatever had been done here had required authorization, resources, and silence. The kind of silence that does not happen naturally. The kind that is maintained. There were signs of human presence beyond the documents. A narrow desk bolted to the floor, a chair positioned with deliberate precision. The surface bore scratches consistent with years of use, not frantic activity but routine. This was a workplace. Someone had come here regularly, perhaps daily, to perform tasks that demanded concentration and discretion. She found evidence of communication equipment, long since dismantled, but its absence was as telling as its presence. The connections had been severed cleanly. This place had not been abandoned in a rush. It had been closed. At one point, she sat down on the edge of a crate and let the weight of the discovery settle. The silence pressed in, thick and unyielding. She thought of the land above, of her plans to guide people through it gently, to offer them a place to slow down and listen. The irony was sharp and unavoidable. Beneath the quiet she had sought to preserve lay the remnants of something that had thrived on secrecy and control. Her thoughts turned to the hatch above, to the rail car, to the canopy that hid it all so effectively. This had not been built to escape the world. It had been built to operate within it, unseen. The ethical question arrived without drama. She could close the hatch, document nothing, speak to no one. The forest would remain silent. Her project could continue. She would carry the knowledge alone, a private burden that no one had asked her to bear. But the thought did not bring relief. It brought a deeper unease. Silence, she realized, would not absolve her. It would implicate her. She examined the documents again, this time with the intent of understanding their scope rather than their detail. Dates spanned decades. Some materials were older than she had expected, reaching back into a period she associated with grainy photographs and half-remembered history. Others extended far more recently, ending abruptly rather than fading out. The closure of this place had been an event, not a gradual decline. When she finally climbed back up into the railcar, the daylight felt harsh, almost intrusive. She replaced the hatch carefully, aligning it exactly as she had found it, and stood in the narrow space for a long moment, hands resting against the walls. The sense of isolation that had disturbed her earlier now felt different. It was no longer the product of architecture alone. It was the weight of knowledge. She stepped out beneath the canopy and looked up through the gaps in the roof, watching the light shift as clouds passed overhead. The forest resumed its ordinary sounds beyond the clearing, indifferent to what lay hidden beneath its roots. By the time she began the walk back along the rail, her decision had settled into place with a clarity that surprised her. There was no anger in it, no sense of betrayal, only the recognition that some discoveries changed the terms of ownership entirely. When she reached her shelter, she did not hesitate. She made the call with measured words, offering no speculation, only facts. She described what she had found and where it was. She answered questions calmly, resisting the urge to interpret what she could not yet fully understand. When she ended the call, the forest seemed unchanged. The trees stood as they always had. The land did not respond to her decision, but she knew that it would. The first signs of change arrived before anyone spoke to her directly. Vehicles appeared at the edge of the forest road, where none had been before, their presence quiet but unmistakable. They did not announce themselves with lights or sirens. They did not hurry. They arrived with the confidence of people who knew exactly where they were going and how long they intended to stay. Within hours, the land she had come to understand through sound, texture, and patient observation was threaded with a new kind of order. Men and women moved through the trees with measured efficiency, careful not to disturb more than necessary, yet leaving no doubt that disturbance was inevitable. Temporary markers appeared, then vanished. Sections of the forest were cordoned off with restraint that felt more deliberate than secrecy. Nothing about the operation suggested panic. It suggested familiarity. She was asked to remain at her shelter at first. The request was polite, framed as a precaution rather than a command, but its meaning was clear. The land was no longer hers in the way it had been only a day earlier. Ownership had shifted into something abstract, suspended by authority she could feel, but not see. When they came to speak with her, it was not as an interrogation. The questions were precise, controlled, and limited to what she had observed and done. She answered carefully, sticking to facts, resisting the temptation to speculate. The people questioning her seemed satisfied with that. They were not searching for a narrative. They were confirming parameters. The canopy and railcar became the center of activity almost immediately. She watched from a distance as specialists examined the structure, their attention focused as much on what surrounded it as on the objects themselves. Measurements were taken, samples collected. The hatch beneath the railcar was accessed without hesitation, as if its existence had been anticipated rather than discovered. It was during one of these moments, as she stood just beyond the temporary boundary line, that she noticed him. He was not marked by rank or posture. He did not stand apart in a way that demanded attention. If anything, he blended into the background more completely than the others, moving with a quiet economy that suggested long experience in places where visibility was a liability. When he approached her, it was without urgency, his steps unhurried, his expression neutral. He did not introduce himself immediately. He asked if she was comfortable, if she needed anything. The questions were ordinary, almost mundane, and that was what made them disarming. When he did offer his name, it was brief, unaccompanied by explanation. He did not say who he worked for, only that he was assigned to oversee certain aspects of what was happening on her land. From the beginning, his manner was different. He did not speak in warnings or reassurances. He spoke in practical terms. He explained where she could walk and where she should not. He told her which questions would be answered and which would not as a threat, but as a matter of fact. When she asked what would happen to the land, he did not offer a promise. He said only that her cooperation would be noted. Their conversations were short, but they accumulated meaning through repetition. He returned more than once, sometimes with information, sometimes with nothing more than a brief check-in. He never pressed her to talk beyond what was necessary. When she volunteered observations, he listened carefully, occasionally asking for clarification, never interrupting. It became clear to her, slowly, that he knew more than he was saying. Not in the vague sense of withheld authority, but in the specific way he responded to certain details. When she mentioned the canopy, his attention sharpened. When she described the rail, he nodded once, as if confirming something already understood. He did not correct her assumptions, but neither did he encourage them. At one point, she asked him directly whether the structure beneath the railcar was known to them before her call. He considered the question longer than he had any other, then answered in a way that did not quite address it. Some places, he said, existed on the margins of record. They were not forgotten so much as set aside. Discovery changed their status, but not their history. As the days passed, the operation continued with disciplined efficiency. Equipment was removed, containers were sealed and transported without ceremony. The railcar itself was examined thoroughly, its contents catalogued, its structure assessed. The canopy drew particular interest. Specialists climbed it, studied its construction, tested its materials. She overheard fragments of conversation that suggested its design had exceeded the expectations of those examining it. Through all of this, the officer remained a constant presence at the edges. He did not supervise openly. He did not give visible orders. Yet when he spoke, people listened. When he suggested adjustments, they were made. His authority was subtle, exercised without display. There were moments when she felt the weight of displacement most acutely. Standing on land she owned, watching decisions made without her input, she experienced a brief surge of resentment. It faded quickly. She understood that whatever had been hidden beneath her land had existed long before her arrival and would continue to shape its future, regardless of her feelings. The officer seemed to sense these moments without her voicing them. On one occasion, he walked with her along a permitted section of the forest, speaking quietly about the terrain, about the way water moved through the soil. It was not information she needed, it was acknowledgement. He treated her as someone still connected to the land, not merely an inconvenience to be managed. As the operation drew toward its conclusion, activity intensified rather than diminished. The rail was dismantled in sections, removed with care that bordered on reverence. The canopy was taken down methodically, each beam catalogued before being transported away. Watching it disappear, she felt an unexpected sense of loss, as if a chapter of the land's life was being erased rather than resolved. On the final day, the officer sought her out one last time. Their conversation was brief. He told her that the land would be returned to her, that official records would reflect no significant findings. He advised her, quietly, to be cautious with what she shared and with whom, not because of legal consequences, but because some truths attracted attention long after their usefulness had ended. When she asked him if he believed she had done the right thing, he did not answer immediately. He looked out toward the forest, where the last vehicles were preparing to leave, and said only that some discoveries did not belong to the person who made them. They belonged to the moment in which they were acknowledged. Then he was gone, absorbed back into the machinery of departure. When the last vehicle disappeared down the road, the forest settled into a silence that felt altered by contrast. The clearing where the canopy had stood was bare, the ground disturbed, but already beginning its slow work of reclamation. The railcar was gone. The hatch beneath it had been sealed, its exact location disguised with care. She stood alone once more on her land, aware that the quiet had returned, but knowing it would never be the same. The officer had helped her navigate the transition without spectacle or false comfort. His presence had not erased the weight of what she had found, but it had steadied it. The land had been changed by her discovery. So had she. And as she began to imagine what came next, she understood that the final shape of her project would be defined as much by what had been removed as by what remained. The land did not reclaim itself all at once. When the last federal vehicles disappeared beyond the bend of the forest road, silence returned unevenly, as if testing whether it was safe to settle again. Birds resumed their calls in hesitant intervals. The wind moved through the canopy without the interference of human voices or machinery, yet the absence left behind felt structured rather than empty. Something had been removed with care, and that care lingered in the disturbed soil and subtly altered paths. She walked the perimeter slowly in the days that followed, not to inspect damage, but to reacquaint herself with what remained. The clearing where the wooden canopy had stood was bare now, the ground compressed and scarred by the weight of beams that had been lifted away piece by piece. There were no broken boards, no forgotten tools. The efficiency of the removal was almost unsettling. It was as though the structure had never existed, except for the faint outline where the earth remembered being shaped. The rail, too, was gone, though not entirely. Portions of it had been dismantled and taken away, but some fragments remained deliberately visible, short stretches of metal half buried in soil and moss, no longer functional, but unmistakably present. They did not lead anywhere now. They interrupted rather than guided. She understood, without being told, that this was intentional. Erasure had limits. Complete absence invited questions of its own. Official confirmation arrived weeks later in the form of a brief document. It stated that no significant findings had been recorded on the property and that all temporary restrictions had been lifted. The language was precise, neutral, and final. There was no mention of the railcar, the canopy, or the space beneath it. No acknowledgement of history, recent or otherwise. The land, according to record, was exactly what it had appeared to be before she arrived. She read the document once, then folded it carefully and placed it among her papers without ceremony. The truth it omitted weighed more heavily than anything it contained. Word spread anyway, though not in any way she could trace directly. It began with curiosity, rather than certainty. People asked about unusual activity, about vehicles seen on the road, about rumors that something old and important had been found and removed. She answered carefully, offering nothing more than what had been made public. Some believed her, others did not. Speculation filled the gaps where facts refused to settle. Interest in the land grew quietly, not the kind driven by spectacle, but by the suggestion of depth. Hikers began asking about access. Riders sent inquiries framed as requests for permission rather than investigation. There was a sense, subtle but persistent, that the place carried a history that resisted explanation. She neither encouraged nor discouraged this perception. She set boundaries clearly and enforced them without apology. When she finally began to shape the land into what she had originally envisioned, she did so with a deeper understanding of restraint. Trails followed natural contours, avoiding the areas where the forest felt most guarded. Informational signs were minimal, focused on ecology rather than narrative. There were no plaques commemorating what had been removed. Silence, she had learned, was not always emptiness. Sometimes it was preservation. The fragments of rail that remained became part of one path, not highlighted, not hidden. Walkers noticed them eventually, often stopping to examine the metal, to run a hand over its cool surface. Some asked questions. She answered them with honesty stripped of detail. The rails, she said, were remnants of something that no longer existed and did not need to. The officer appeared again, months later, without announcement. She saw him first at a distance, walking along the edge of the forest with the same unhurried pace she remembered. He did not come often, and when he did, he never stayed long. Their conversations were brief, unremarkable to an outside observer. He asked how the land was doing. She asked if he was well. Neither pressed for more. Once, as they stood near the path where the rail fragments lay, he paused and looked down at them thoughtfully. "Some things are easier to manage when they are partially visible," he said. Complete concealment invited obsession. She understood the remark for what it was, not advice, but confirmation. As seasons passed, the forest softened the last visible traces of disruption. Plants took root in compacted soil. Fallen leaves obscured the outlines left by heavy equipment. The place where the canopy had stood became indistinguishable from the surrounding ground, except to her. She avoided building anything there, not out of fear, but out of respect for what the land had already carried. Visitors came and went. Some stayed longer than they planned, drawn by the quiet and the sense of layered time. Others left quickly, unsettled by a feeling they could not articulate. She observed without judgment. Not every place was meant to be comfortable. Some existed to remind people that comfort was not the only measure of value. At night, alone in her shelter, she sometimes thought of the railcar, of the careful order inside it, of the life that had once unfolded there in deliberate isolation. She wondered about the people whose names had appeared in the documents, about the choices that had led them to work beneath the forest, unseen. The questions never resolved themselves. They did not need to. What remained was a land that had accepted her presence without surrendering its past. She had come to protect it from harm, and in doing so, had learned that protection did not always mean exposure or explanation. Sometimes it meant allowing certain truths to rest where they belonged. On a late afternoon, walking the length of the main trail as the light filtered low through the trees, she stopped beside the rail fragments once more. Moss had begun to creep over the metal, softening its edges. In time, it would blend fully into the forest floor, neither erased nor emphasized. She stood there for a while, listening to the layered sounds of wind, insects, distant water. The land felt settled, not resolved, but balanced. She turned back toward the path, toward the life she had built piece by careful piece, and continued walking, knowing that the place would endure without explanation, and that this, in the end, was enough. If this story held your attention, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters and other stories already waiting here. Watch the recommended videos to continue exploring similar narratives. And if you think this story is worth sharing, send it to someone who appreciates thoughtful storytelling.